Hello everyone, welcome back to Introduction to Philosophy. This week we're going to continue our unit on epistemology. Remember, that's the study of knowledge. Alright, let's jump in. So this week we're going to be tackling problems of skepticism. We're going to continue this into the next week, but we're going to start now. So in philosophy, there's a number of different ways to be a skeptic. Right? Think of any particular view, you could be a skeptic about that thing, or any particular issue you could be a skeptic about, right? So for example, you might be a skeptic of the notion that anything can have objective meaning at all, whether that's like conceptual meaning or meaning in terms of value, right? You could be a skeptic about any number of things there. You might be a skeptic about the notion that there are moral facts, right? That it really means something to say that X is wrong or X is right. You might be a skeptic about whether or not there's such a thing as consciousness. Yeah? So you can be a skeptic about any kind of particular thing in philosophy. But there's also this kind of skepticism that's more general. We call this global skepticism. The global skeptic wants to suggest that we don't know anything at all, right? Not just about these narrow specific issues, but in a very general, all-encompassing sense. Okay, so if they're right, there's not much reason to continue doing what we are. Right? There's not much reason to continue doing philosophy if the global skeptic is right. It simply becomes impossible to make any kind of progress, right? We can't know anything. So we would like, if possible, to avoid global skepticism. But before we know how to do that, we need to know what's at stake, right? We need to know what it is that the global skeptic is actually targeting. We need to know what knowledge is. Okay, so what is knowledge? Well, typically, when we, as philosophers, try to give definitions, we try to find the necessary and sufficient conditions for that class. Right? So what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for knowledge? We need to understand then what necessity and sufficiency are. Okay, so a thing is necessary, right? A trait is necessary if it has to be there in order for that classification to be appropriate. Sounds kind of complicated, but it's not really. Here's some examples that help make it clear. Three-sidedness to triangles. Right? So what does this mean? It cannot be a triangle without having three sides. Seems simple enough, right? So three-sidedness is necessary then for triangles. Okay. Being a mammal to being a human, right? You cannot be a human without also being a mammal, right? So being a mammal then is a necessity for being human. Okay, pretty easy. What about sufficiency? Sufficiency, rather, just means that if it's present, if that trait is present, that is enough. That is good enough for us to say that the classification is appropriate. So again, some examples might help make this clear. Being angry to experiencing an emotion, right? If you're angry currently, is that enough to say that you're experiencing some kind of emotion? Surely, right? That's certainly the case. So being angry then is sufficient to experiencing emotion. However, take the same example and think about necessity. Is being angry a necessary condition to experiencing an emotion? No, right? Because you might be sad. You might be happy, right? There's all kinds of other emotions that you might be experiencing. Okay, second example. Being a tennis ball to being a sphere, right? If you're a tennis ball, right, then you're a sphere, or at least a tennis ball in good condition, yeah? If you're a tennis ball right out of the packaging, you're a sphere. It's sufficient to being a sphere. But there's all kinds of other things that could be spheres too. So being a tennis ball is then not necessary for being a sphere. See how these two things are somewhat different. Necessity means it has to be there. Sufficiency means if it's there, it's good enough. Okay? So we want to know what the necessary and sufficient conditions for knowledge are. Okay, so is knowledge just belief, right? Most philosophers, and I think most of us more generally, even if you haven't reflected on it very much, think that knowledge is at least a belief, right? So most of us think that belief is necessary for knowledge. You have to have a belief in order for there to be knowledge. But is that good enough, right? Is that sufficient? Even if we think it's necessary, that doesn't mean it's sufficient to get us knowledge. Well, let's put it to the test, right? Most of you have probably seen this image before, right? It was huge on the internet, I'd say maybe like 6 to 8 years ago now. It's been a bit, a lifetime in the age of the internet. Okay. The question here, what color do you believe the dress to be? A lot of people report that the dress is white and gold, while others report that the dress is blue and black, right? So people have different beliefs about the color of this dress. The further question is your belief about the color of the dress enough to give you knowledge of the color of the dress? Well, it turns out that the dress, in fact, is black and blue. So if you merely believed that it was white and gold, well, it turned out that that was wrong, right? It turned out that that was wrong. So even though you believed it very strongly, it seems like it would be a mistake to claim that you knew it was white and gold. How could you know that it was white and gold if it isn't, right? It isn't. So it seems like we're missing some ingredient. Belief might be necessary for knowledge, but it doesn't seem to be sufficient, okay? We're missing something. What might we be missing? Well, it could be truth, right? What was missing from that last example? Well, the people who believed that the dress was white and gold, they were simply wrong, right? What if they had been right? Would they then have had knowledge? Well, we can put it to the test again, right? Is true belief enough? Okay. Think about the number of stars in the galaxy, right? How many of them are there? How many stars are there out there? That seems, at least currently, impossible for us to know. It just doesn't seem possible. However, there is an answer, right? There is a fact of the matter, which means it is the case that either the total number of stars in the universe is odd or it's even. It's got to be one of those if the number is finite, right? Okay. So what if then I form the belief that the number of stars in the universe is even? Could be true, right? In fact, I've got a 50-50 chance, right? So I now have a 50-50 chance that I know that the number of stars in the galaxy is even, or in the universe is even. It's pretty good odds for a belief on such a large scale, right? It seems like that shouldn't count as knowledge, right? Even if I'm right, it seems like that should not count as knowledge. Why? Well, because it was just lucky, right? It seemed like a lucky guess. Okay, so we might include an ingredient like justification, right? We'll hear more about justification in just a moment. Why might we need it? To block out this thing that we epistemologists call epistemic luck. Epistemic luck is basically exactly as it sounds. You might hold a belief that is true merely by chance. Okay, right, so another example. Let's say I asked you right now to form a belief about a number I'm thinking of, right? It's a number 1 through 9. And let's say you happen to believe, oh, well, he's thinking of 5. You're right, right? You got it right. But did you have any reason for thinking that? Not really. You just chose a number 1 through 9, and it happened to be the number I was thinking of. You got lucky, right? You got lucky. Would we want to call your true belief knowledge? Probably not, because of this luck, right? So we want to have something that blocks out cases in which our beliefs are true merely as a matter of luck, right? To do this, we build in a component called justification. Justification is a tricky issue, right? There are philosophers who disagree as to what justification means, how much you need. But what you need to know now is just that justification is some process, some status of your beliefs being reasoned, right? Having reasons for them. Okay. All right. So knowledge then seems to be a list of 3 necessary ingredients. Knowledge seems to be having a belief that is true, that we are justified in holding, right? So in philosophy, we call this JTB, justified true belief. That's what knowledge is supposed to be. Okay. So now that we have an idea of what we're talking about when we talk about knowledge, we can return to the broader topic of skepticism, right? So when we know what knowledge is, can we get it? Okay. First up here, we're going to look into Descartes' Meditations. Okay. So Meditations is probably the most famous work that we get from Descartes. In the Meditations, Descartes sits down and tries to rethink all of the things he has come to believe over the course of his life. He subjects them to a sort of method of doubt in order to see which of them are actually true, right? So he's trying to rebuild all of human knowledge from his armchair. It's interesting. Okay, let's jump in. This is Descartes. A quote: "In order to seek truth, it is necessary once in the course of our life to doubt as far as possible of all things." That's in the intro of Meditations, right? So you can kind of see where he's going to be going here. All right, Meditations 1 and 2. As I said, in the preface to the Meditations, Descartes expresses that he's become concerned that a lot of the beliefs he's held over the years have turned out false. Right, so he becomes suspicious of the rest of his beliefs. He doesn't know which of them are good and which of them are bad. This leads him to wondering how he can sort between the two, right? Ultimately leads to this project of trying to rebuild human knowledge altogether. Okay. Before we start, though, I want to make it clear that though we're talking about skepticism and global skepticism, Descartes himself is not a skeptic, right? What Descartes is doing is trying to rebuild, but he's trying to rebuild from very, very firm foundations. He wants to locate beliefs that we can hold with certainty, right? That we cannot really doubt, that the skeptic has no room for questioning, and then build on top of those. But in order to get to those, he's going to have to employ some of the skeptic's tools to do so. So that's what we're going to see from him here. Why certainty, though? Why is he after these certain foundations from which to build upon? Well, much like you want your the foundations of your house to be very firm, very stable, Descartes wants the same for his beliefs, right? He wants the bottom level upon which the structure of all of his remaining beliefs are going to be built. He wants it to be very, very firm, unquestionable, right? If it's not, he's concerned that the whole thing could collapse, right? That's why we're going for certainty here. But because he's going for certainty, we're going to end up subjecting quite a lot to this doubt, this radical doubt that he's going to employ. Okay. The way in which Descartes decides he's going to sort good beliefs from bad ones, or certain beliefs from uncertain ones, is by employing a method of doubt. Here's how it works. If there's something that can be doubted, just in principle, then it's not certain. And if it's not certain, Descartes is going to choose consciously not to believe it. Why? Because it could be false. It's not that it is false because he can doubt it. It's just that it could be. Okay. The very possibility, though, that it could be false means it's not going to do for those firm foundations, right? two things to note here. First, Descartes takes it that if we are certain about something, if we cannot find room to doubt something, that means it has to be true, right? How is he locating these firm, certain foundations? Subjecting it to doubt. If he can't find doubt, yeah, it's certain, it's firm, it's true, right? Do you think that's the case? That if a belief is certain, it has to be true? Well, there's a difference between a belief being certain in the sense that there is no possible objecting to it, and us holding a belief with certainty simply because we cannot figure out how to object to it, right? The second form of certainty doesn't seem to imply truth the way that Descartes wants, right? Why? Well, because it might be due to a limit of my creativity, right? Maybe I simply couldn't find a way to subject a certain belief to doubt. That doesn't mean that it can't be doubted, right? Okay, moving on though. Second, employing this kind of method, this method of radical doubt, means that he's ultimately going to throw away a lot of beliefs that are probably true, right? In subjecting everything to so much doubt, you end up, as we saw with James, this is more or less what James was cautioning us of, we're going to end up throwing out a lot. Descartes is willing to do this because he is in search of those foundations, right? In his mind, that's fine. So long as we can get our foundations, we can rebuild everything, right? We might lose something for now, but we'll get it back, right? We'll get it back once we have developed our foundations. Okay. He thinks this is going to be too big of a task to go about testing our beliefs one by one. Take any one belief, subject it to doubt, test it, move on to another belief. He thinks that's going to take way too much time. So what he thinks we should do instead is break our beliefs up into the principles by which we came to them, right? So we all have different ways in which we come to our beliefs in the first place, and those methods are the things that we should subject to doubt. Because if you can find a problem with that method, the way in which you came to those beliefs, you can get rid of all of the beliefs that were formed by them, right? So you can sort of do batches of beliefs in this way. Okay, so the first one he wants to test like this is to do with sensation and perception, right? One and the same for him. Okay, knowledge through the senses. Testing knowledge through the senses does seem to make sense, right, as a starting place. Why? Because most of us don't really stop to think about it, right? I see this computer in front of me. I don't really stop to think well, do I really see this computer in front of me? No, it just seems pretty intuitively clear to me that I do. That kind of assumption, though, Descartes is afraid of, right? That kind of unquestioned assumption, Descartes is trying to avoid. He wants to carefully consider everything. He wants to subject everything to this radical form of doubt. Okay, so can we be sure of the senses then? Let's not just take them for granted. Can we be sure of them? Or can we doubt them? Well, Descartes thinks it's pretty trivially true that we can doubt them. Right, we've all had experiences, whether they be like optical illusions or simple phenomena you see out in the world, like a mirage, or the image here on screen, refraction, right? Where our eyes are telling us something that we know is not the case. So in this particular image, the straw appears to be broken in the water, right? It's not a solid unit. We know that's not the case. That in reality the straw is continuous. It does form a single unit. But the water makes it appear, the refraction of the water does make it appear as though it's separate. Our senses, our perception, is giving us an appearance that is false, right? Well, if that's the case, Descartes wants to say, there is room to doubt the knowledge that we gain through the senses. And remember, he's looking at principles here. He's not looking at these individual instances like, okay, so your belief about the straw in this cup then, since you can doubt it, you have to throw it out. No, he's looking at the principle in general, right? So if it's possible to doubt knowledge through the senses, you got to throw it out completely. Knowledge through the senses, all gone, right? Pretty big move. Pretty big move here that's going to have some drastic consequences. Let's see. Okay. Descartes wants to give us a little bit of a way out here. He says, maybe we don't have to reject all of the senses all at once, right? It might be the case that the senses work most of the time exactly as they're supposed to. And it just so happens that in certain circumstances, things go awry. For example, when a stick is in water, it looks bent. When things are farther away, they appear smaller. When we're tired or we're under certain kinds of medication, things might look totally different than the way they're supposed to. But those are all special cases, right? What about ordinary experience? If learning through sense experience works fine under ordinary circumstances, then maybe we don't have to doubt the whole method of coming to those beliefs in general, right? So is there any reason to think that your experience of, let's say, watching this lecture right now should be doubted? Well, Descartes, while he thinks this is hard, ultimately does find a way. He ultimately does find a way. We are going to hear about that now, but before we do, note that Descartes is going after certainty here, okay? So his standard is very high. When your standard is very high in this way, you're able to entertain certain kinds of doubts that you would not ordinarily entertain, right? So what Descartes is about to suggest might seem kind of outlandish, but keep in mind, it's only because he's looking for certainty. It's only because he's looking for certainty. All right, so let's see how he gets us here. It's called the dreaming hypothesis, right? So Descartes considers that he might be dreaming instead of sitting by the fire in his dressing gown. He tells us when he's writing the meditations that he's sitting there in front of his fire, like in his dressing gown, thinking about all of this stuff. Okay, so that's it, right? Maybe instead of actually being here giving this lecture right now, I'm just dreaming it, right? Maybe it's not genuinely real in the way that I think. It's just an experience that my mind is creating, right? Okay, well, in order for that to work, first, you need it to be possible that dreams can appear the same as ordinary waking life. Descartes thinks that we should accept that. He thinks we've all kind of had these dreams, or at least we can think of this being possible, right? That dreams could resemble real life. And if that's the case, that's more or less all he needs, right? The second kind of like challenge that he needs to bat away, you might be wondering like, okay, well, I know that I'm not dreaming because I can like pinch myself or something. I would wake up, right? Here's the problem. If you're actually dreaming, there's not going to be a way to test whether you're dreaming or not, because the test you perform would also be in the dream, right? The result of whatever test you performed could be dreamed as well. So there is no way to employ a test that tells you whether you're dreaming or awake, okay? So it seems like Descartes might have us here, right? Think of any experience that you have, any experience that you gain through perception. Could that not have just been dreamed? And if that's a possibility, how do you tell which is which, right? How do you tell which is the genuine experience and which is merely the dreamed one? No test can do it for you. So it seems like there's no evidence to lead you one way or the other. And if there's no evidence to lead you one way or the other, then you kind of have to forestall your conclusion, right? You cannot say one way or the other whether you're dreaming or not. That's the dreaming hypothesis, okay? Okay, so the problem. The things that appear to us in dreams are not true. At best, the things we dream are weak impressions of things that actually are. So if it's possible that we're merely dreaming and the things that appear to us in dreams aren't true, What does that mean? Yes, we can doubt every single thing that we perceive, right? Because it could have all just been a dream. And again, for Descartes, if you can doubt it, you have to throw it out. It cannot count. It cannot be one of these firm foundations. So we have to get rid of it. Okay, so if there's no way to tell whether or not you're dreaming, and dreams can appear just like waking life, then there is no reason to conclude now that we are not dreaming. But if we might be dreaming now, and nothing that appears in dreams is true, then all of the beliefs that originate from our senses might be false. Where there's doubt, throw it out. Right? Should seem kind of familiar, right? These movies are now old, especially the one on top. This is like a very old movie now. It wasn't so much for me when it came out. But these movies both express like similar ideas, right? That you could merely be dreaming or having some kind of false experience that seems genuine, right? In fact, like unmistakably genuine. There's no way of telling what's the right one and what's the wrong one, right? Okay. But surely some things that we experience are true regardless of whether we're dreaming, right? Descartes considers this as well. For example, he thinks that regardless of whether we're dreaming or not, there are some simple things, like I know the color red, right? So if I'm dreaming and I experience red, it's still the case that I experienced red, right? That there is the color red. I also know that objects are extended in space, right? They have length, they have width, etc. Even if I'm concerned that I'm dreaming here. I also know some other things, right? 2 + 2 = 4. That doesn't seem to matter whether I'm dreaming or not. 2 + 2 is still going to equal 4. Triangles are still, going to have 3 sides, regardless of whether I'm dreaming. None of this changes. So it doesn't seem like this dreaming hypothesis destroys all of knowledge altogether, right? It just kind of is a problem for knowledge gained through the senses, okay? So Descartes tries to limit the amount of harm here. However, Descartes does come up with another problem that's going to be even more out there, right? That allows us to doubt even these things, okay? This is called, it varies. Sometimes it's the evil genius, sometimes it's the evil demon, sometimes it's the cosmic deceiver, right? These are all the same problem. Here's how it goes. Assume for the sake of argument that there is some all-powerful being, right? Call it God, call it a demon, whatever you want. Remember, again, that even if you don't believe that this is true, because we're after certainty, you're allowed to speculate more or less wildly, right? If you think it's even possible, then it gets to count as a doubt. And if it gets to count as a doubt, if you can apply that to any particular belief, that belief goes out the window as far as finding certainty goes, right? Okay, so just, for the sake of the argument, accept that it's possible that there could be some all-powerful being, right? Even if you don't think there is one. Okay. If there were an all-powerful being, could it deceive us convincingly? Could it convince us of things and make us think that what we believe as a result really genuinely is true? Well, yeah, that seems to come out of the notion of being all-powerful, right? That just seems to follow. Okay, so for Descartes, God does exist, right? Descartes does believe in God, and he believes in an all-powerful God. So he thinks God really could do that. God could definitely deceive us about anything. But Descartes also thinks that God is necessarily supremely good, which means that he could not, or would not, rather, deceive us. That's why we now have the evil genius, right? So Descartes considers, well, what if there were a being like God who were all-powerful but not supremely good? Well, in that case, it seems like everything could be put up to question, right? Okay, so let's think back to these things. 2 plus 2 equals 4, right? Triangles have 3 sides. What if the evil genius has just convinced you that that's the case? And really, 2 plus 2 equals 5, right? If the evil genius were omnipotent, all-powerful, seems possible, right? So if you think it's possible for there to be an all-powerful being, then you must, as a consequence, think it's possible that you've been deceived about even these most basic things. Well, okay, applying Descartes' standard, right? If there's room to doubt, you have to throw it out. Why? Because it's not certain. So all of these things now, Descartes is getting rid of. Now, we're not just getting rid of sense experience, right? Which was enough, right? We were already at the point where we were doubting whether or not we're involved in this lecture right now, or simply dreaming about the lecture, right? Whether or not you actually, walk downstairs and enjoy breakfast in the morning, or you're still in your bed dreaming that you did, right? That was pretty far as it was. Now we're at the point, we're not even sure 2 plus 2 equals 4. We're not even sure triangles have 3 sides. I don't know that I have a body. I don't know that there's an earth. There's more or less nothing now that I'm left with after this radical degree of doubt, right? Is there anything left? Is there anything at all? Descartes says yes. There is some light at the end of the tunnel. Thankfully, right? Because he hasn't left us with very much. Okay, so if I can be deceived about practically anything, then what is left to be certain about? Well, in order to be deceived, I must in some respect exist, right? Because if I don't exist, there's no one there to be deceived. In other words, in order for me to do the doubting about all of these things that I've just brought into doubt, there has to be a doubter, right? Someone, something has to exist to do the doubting. Cogito ergo sum just means I think, therefore I am, right? Or I doubt, therefore I am, right? So what can we know for sure? We exist, or I exist, right? Maybe I don't get to know that you exist yet, but I do know that I exist. Why? Because I'm doing the thinking right now. I'm thinking about it, and therefore I must. Descartes says, I am, I exist, is necessarily true each time that I pronounce it, or that I mentally conceive it. Merely thinking it guarantees its truth, right? So we can know at least one thing, right, that we exist. It might not seem like a lot, but Descartes is going to go from this belief to try and build up all of human knowledge once again, right? So it doesn't seem like a lot, but he does end up, in his mind, successfully rebuilding everything. Okay, the way in which he does that, we're not really going to spend any time on. It's an interesting project. You can get the meditations for free anywhere online if you would like to look into it. More or less as a quick summary, he thinks that God's existence is a necessary fact. He gives several reasons for thinking so. And once you have your existence plus God's existence, along with the notion that God is not going to deceive you, you get to build back a bunch of stuff. Like, for example, you get to build back the fact that you have a body. You get to build back the fact that there's an external world around you and that you get to learn things about it, right? So he starts to rebuild everything from there. That goes too far afield for us. But note that as a process of this rational doubt, really the only thing that survives is yourself, right? That you exist. That's the only thing that survives at this point in the meditations. Okay, this leads us to a position that we, like contemporary philosophers, call external world skepticism. Okay, so external world skepticism is it's like a specific kind of skepticism, not the global kind. The global kind we got out of that evil genius problem, right? This is a more localized kind that suggests that we can't know anything about the external world, The external world is just the world outside of you, right? So there's your inner world where all of your thoughts and your beliefs reside, and then there's the external world that you engage with your body, that sort of thing. So external world skepticism suggests that we just can't know anything about the external world, or rather, a more moderate form, we don't have enough reason to say that we know anything about the external world, right? Why? Well, because all of the evidence that we could use to claim knowledge about the external world also supports the dreaming hypothesis, right? All of the things that I think I know about the external world could have just been dreamed, right? Well, why do I think there's a computer in front of me? Because I can see it. You know, I can reach out and I can touch it. It looks a certain way to me, right? If I was bold enough, if I was curious enough, I could taste it even, right? It's here. I can see it. Okay, but all of that evidence also supports the idea that I'm just dreaming it, right? Because in a dream, hypothetically, it would appear just as robust. Okay. If you have these two competing hypotheses, one, I'm awake, this is the real world. Two, I'm merely dreaming, this is the dreamed world, not true. And the evidence doesn't lead you to accept one over the other, it seems like you have to remain neutral. But if you remain neutral, that means you don't get to claim you know anything about the outside world. And that's a pretty rough spot to be in, right? That's external world skepticism. Okay. We're now going to look at an argument against this kind of external world skepticism that comes out of Descartes. So remember, while Descartes himself was not a skeptic, he thought that from the cogito ergo sum, he could rebuild our knowledge of the external world. Others dismiss his rebuilding, but accept his demolishing, right? They accept the demolishing process that Descartes introduces, but then they do not go through the rebuilding process. To those people, G.E. Moore has a response, right? This is a G.E. Moore. This quote of his is just a fun one. He says, "It is raining, but I do not believe that it is." This is an example of what we call Moore's paradox, right? Moore's paradox has to do with like a belief that it's technically meaningful. Like we kind of understand what this means, what this person would be saying, but it's not something that you could ever reasonably say, right? No person could ever reasonably believe this, right? That it is raining, but I do not believe it is. Sort of interesting. Okay. G.E. Moore wants to argue that we should go back to common sense. Okay. Let's get an idea of his background first, though. So at the end of the 19th century, idealism was the main view we had going on in Western philosophy. Idealism is the view that reality is purely mental, right? There is no physical stuff. You talk about the external world? No, there's no physical stuff at all, right? The opposite view that is fairly popular among philosophers today is called materialism or physicalism. That's the view that reality is just physical, right? Okay. At the time, idealism was in vogue, right? Everyone who was famous in Western philosophy at the time was an idealist. They thought that there was no external world that was physical. Everything was mental. Moore and Bertrand Russell, his colleague, were frustrated with this view, to say the least. Why? Well, because it wasn't really creating any progress, right? Especially when they looked at the sciences that were developing pretty rapidly at the time. Philosophers weren't really achieving much with this background idea. So he, quote unquote, revolted. They call it the revolt, right? The philosophical revolt in favor of common sense, right? So here's how it works. Moore roughly argues like this. Premise 1. It is a matter of common sense to believe in ordinary external things, right? We can't really help but do it. It's a common intuition. We all accept that there's things that exist outside of ourselves. Premise 2. No argument has been given that shows that external things cannot exist, only that they might not. Premise 3. If two conclusions are equally likely, logically speaking, then we should side with common sense. Conclusion, we should believe in ordinary external things. Okay, so how does this work? More or less, he's saying that the dreaming hypothesis does not tell us that external things like the computer here in front of me, this does not exist. It doesn't say that. It can't say that. Rather, it just tries to get me to remain neutral. It tries to get me to conclude that, look, it might not exist. Okay, that's fine. But what Moore wants to say here is that you shouldn't remain neutral. You shouldn't remain neutral. Why? Because one of those sides goes hand in hand with common sense, right? So it has something more going for it than this other side does. So the ground is not actually neutral, according to Moore. One of them has common sense on its side, and the other doesn't. So while the evidence might support both of them equally, there's something that counts in addition to the evidence, right? Like common sense. Okay. He thinks, if you believe that at least, that it's okay to believe in ordinary external things. That's what common sense leads us to do. All right. So sure, there might not be an external world, but there also might be. The skeptic would have us remain neutral about the matter, but common sense is on the side of there being an external world. So according to Moore, we ought to believe in one. In his proof of an external world, he goes a bit further, right? Okay, before we start, we have to know what Moore means by external. Here's a quote. To say of anything, for example, my body, that it is external to my mind, means merely that from a proposition to the effect that it existed at a specified time, there in no case follows the further proposition that I was having experience at the time in question. Makes sense, right? So external in English here just means that the thing can exist without anyone experiencing it, right? So, I take my glasses here, right, and I put them in a drawer, turn off the lights, leave the house, right? Do they still exist? If so, they're an external thing. If they depend on my experiencing them in order to exist, not external, right? So we can think of some things by that definition that wouldn't be external, right? Like an emotion, like feeling angry, right? If no one's there to feel it, it doesn't exist, right? So it needs to be experienced in order to exist. Okay. So here's the proof then. I can prove now, for instance, that two human hands exist. How? By holding up my two hands and saying, as I make a certain gesture with the right hand, here is one hand, and adding, as I make a certain gesture with the left, and here is another. And nothing else. There's nothing else. That just is the proof. What do you think? Has he proved that there are two things that exist externally, right? Two things that exist even if no one is experiencing them. Here's one hand, here's another, right? Is that proof enough? Well, Moore continues. He says, if you're not satisfied with this, you ought to know that we accept arguments like this all the time. For instance, if there's some question that we need to settle between two people who disagree, one way of proving your stance is to demonstrate it. So for example, if there is a disagreement about how many quarters there are in like a standard roll of quarters, one way we can resolve the issue is to count them all, right? This is a demonstration. I am demonstrating to you that there are, $10 worth of quarters in here. That there are, $10 worth of quarters. I've proved it, haven't I? By showing you. Proved it by showing you. Moore says this is the same thing. I'm showing you that there are external things. So why shouldn't that be an acceptable proof? Okay. Well, Moore anticipates that there are going to be quite a few objections to this move of his. So does a skeptic have any response? Sure. Moore anticipates two of them. The first, Moore has to prove the propositions in his premises before counting them as justification for his conclusion. In English, that means that Moore really hasn't proven his reasoning yet. Right? Moore hasn't really given us reason to accept that which he's taken to support his conclusion that there is an external world, right? That there are things that exist externally. Here's what Moore says. They want a proof of what I assert now when I hold up my hands and say, here's one hand and here's another. So they want a proof for this, right? Moore's response is this. This kind of proof can never be given and should thus not be demanded. Okay? Interesting, right? So the skeptic more or less is saying, you're simply insisting that when you do this, that these two things are external. You're just insisting that that's the case. You're not actually proving that that's the case. You haven't given me proof yet. And Moore is saying, look, the kind of proof you're looking for beyond this, like, this is something. If you're looking for proof beyond this, you're looking for a kind of proof that can't be given ever. And if a proof just in principle can't ever be given, then it shouldn't be demanded. Right? That's his argument, but it's not clear why that follows. Right? Why should it not be demanded just because it can't be given? Maybe it can't be given because that kind of knowledge is impossible. Right? So the skeptic's not going to be satisfied here. Moore has a response. Again, he says, that kind of skepticism is misguided. Right? Why? Well, Moore suggests that there are certain kinds of things that we can know that cannot be proven. So if the skeptic here is claiming that, look, because you can't prove it, you can't know it, Moore thinks he has it the wrong way around, right? No, there are some things we can know that we cannot prove. For example, that this means that there are external things, right? Okay. Whether or not you think that's the case is up for debate, right? Is it the case that there's some things we can know that we cannot prove, right? In thinking about this question, think back to the discussion we saw, or not discussion, but the heated exchange we saw between Clifford and James, right? Clifford might not agree with Moore here, right? You can't prove it. That probably means you don't have sufficient evidence for believing it. If you can't even believe it reasonably, you certainly can't know it, right? Not if knowledge is JTB. But James, remember, James wanted to persuade us to think that, no, it's okay to believe in some things that you don't have solid evidence for. In fact, it might even be okay to believe in some things you have no evidence for, so long as those beliefs are really important to you, right? If that's the case, maybe you can have some beliefs that end up being knowledge that you cannot prove, right? So how you land on Clifford James might determine how you land here, right? Is Moore right in his response to the skeptic? Can he get away with this? I'm very interested to hear your thoughts. Next time, we're going to move away from external world skepticism back to that kind of global skepticism. So we took the dreaming hypothesis from Descartes and we built it into this external world skepticism problem. We saw Moore's response to that. But what about that other skeptical worry that Descartes had? That we could maybe be wrong about everything. Well, we're going to hear some possibilities there, and we're going to look at some responses to those kind of possibilities too. We're also going to look at this interesting piece. It's only like 3 pages long, by Edmund Gettier, called "Is Justified True Belief Knowledge?" Right. So Gettier is going to challenge the notion that we even understand what knowledge is. Right. He himself is not a skeptic, but he's going to suggest that our notion of knowledge might be wrong altogether. We're going to look at a response to him as well. Okay, that's it for today. So stay healthy, stay safe, and see